I call this meeting to order. Bonjour et bienvenue tout le monde.
Welcome, everyone. Today's meeting will be in the hybrid form in accordance with the House Order adopted on January 25th, 2021, and the members will be present or through the Zoom application. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. So you are aware, the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee.
To a speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do the best we can to maintain a consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they are participating virtually or in person. Pursuant to Standing Order 1064, the committee is meeting today to consider a request received by the clerk and submitted by 4 members of the committee to discuss their request for additional witnesses for the study of addressing sexual misconduct issues in the Canadian Armed Forces, including the allegations against former Chief of the Defence Staff, Jonathan Vance. Members have all received the letter. I will now open the floor for debate. And who would like to speak first to the 1064? Oh, I see you, I recognize you, Mr. Bazan. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank you for calling the emergency meeting under 1082. So I'll move, or 1064, but I'll move the following motion so we can kick off debate, and then I'll speak to that motion, Madam Chair. So the motion and
Mr. Bazan, do you have a copy of that motion?
We are going to circulate it right now. I believe my staff is sending that to the clerk, and he can circulate it around. But I believe that we've been through this a number of times already, Madam Chair, so I'm sure that the format and is quite familiar to all members of the committee. So the motion reads as follows: that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the Standing Committee on National Defence, concerning its study on addressing sexual misconduct issues in the Canadian Armed Forces, including the allegations against former Chief of Defence Staff Jonathan Vance and the allegations against Chief of Defence Staff Art MacDonald, invite Katie Telford, Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, to testify for no less than 2 hours, that the meeting be held in public and be televised, and that the witness be called to testify within 7 days of this motion passing. And that is being circulated or sent to the clerk right now. I believe that the clerk checks his inbox, it'll be there. So, Madam Chair, the purpose of that motion is to follow up on testimony that we heard last week after having Elder Marquez at committee, that he made it very clear that he was instructed by Katie Telford to get in contact with the PCO and with the Chief of Staff to the Minister of National Defence. If we look at this chronologically, we know that on March the 1st, 2018, we had the former ombudsman for the Canadian Armed Forces, Gary Walbourne, try to give evidence to the Minister of National Defence, Harjit Sajjan, and there was a complaint of sexual misconduct against Jonathan Vance when he was the Chief of Defence Staff. We know that Mr. Sajjan pushed away that evidence, but he did pass on the exchange of and that discussion with the ombudsman to his Chief of Staff, Zita Estrabas. Now, based upon the testimony of Elder Marquez, Zita Estrabas, who we have asked to appear at this committee in the past and has yet to do so, was then went to Katie Telford as Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister and to inform her that this complaint of sexual misconduct come forward. That information was then shared with Elder Marquez on March the 2nd, and then that information was then passed down to the Clerk of the Privy Council. Meetings and conversations, as Elder Marquez talked about during his testimony last week, included the multiple conversations with both the Chief of Staff to the Minister, Zita Estrabas, and multiple conversations with Katie Telford as Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister. It is very much germane to our study to find out what Katie Telford was told? How much did she direct this investigation and ultimately a cover-up? Because we know that the investigation never took place, that once they made the decision at the Privy Council office that the information was being withheld, by the middle of March, all of this was swept under the rug. And as the former clerk of the Privy Council, Michael Warnick, said, that he lost sight of line of sight on this issue concerning sexual misconduct by General Vance. Now, Madam Chair, we need to find out if Katie Telford briefed the Prime Minister. We need to find out how much of the information and emails that went back and forth between Janine Sherman and Zita Estravis and Michael Warnick, as well as Elder Marquez, was handed into her office and directly to her as Chief of Staff, whether or not she ever briefed the Prime Minister, whether or not she shared that information with others within the Prime Minister's office and the PCO. We know that there was briefing notes prepared by both Mr. Warnick as well as Janine Sherman for conversations that they had. And in all these emails and briefings, they always talked about sexual misconduct, quite contrary to the Prime Minister saying that he didn't know it was a Me Too allegation until after. But we need to make sure that we get down to the bottom of this information. And the only way we can do that, Madam Chair, and I believe that my colleagues will agree, is that we have to have Katie Telford appear at this committee for 2 hours and this isn't something new. We're not setting any precedent here, because we know that Katie Telford appeared to discuss the WE scandal previously in this Parliament. So for her to appear, and she has said on the record that she takes responsibility for all staff in the Prime Minister's office, then she needs to appear before us, explain what the information was that she was given by Zita Estravis on March the 1st and March the 2nd, what she did with that information. And if she did not inform the Prime Minister, why didn't she tell Prime Minister Trudeau that something this egregious had occurred and was not followed up on? She needs to tell us why the Prime Minister was withheld this information. Was it because of circumstances that were happening at that time, including the Prime Minister's own issue at that time? There was other issues happening within the Prime Minister's office. We know that on March the 8th, that Vice Admiral Mark Norman was charged by the RCMP over an investigation directed by the Prime Minister's office himself. So there's a lot of things that were at play there, and we need to get down to the bottom of how this impacted, and ultimately how they left General Vance in charge of the Canadian Armed Forces, in charge of Operation Honor, and undermined stomping out sexual misconduct within the armed forces for the past 3 years. We could have dealt with this back in 2018. And this committee has been dealing with this for 3 months now. And it is time, as we have said in the past, that we want to make sure we respect the timelines that are available. We want to make sure, and actually I see that is not in that motion, which I would like to add at the bottom of this is is that we respect the timelines that were agreed to. I think it was on the April 6th meeting, as requested by the Bloc Québécois, so that we can ensure that we get this study wrapped up, that the drafting of the report for our analysts can continue moving forward, that our committee can consider that draft report at the end of May, and that we can get it tabled back in the House by early June. So, Madam Chair, I just ask that all our colleagues around this table, regardless of political affiliation, will want to do the right thing of discovering the truth of what happened with the allegations back on March 1st, 2018, and that we all strive forward to protecting the men and women in uniform, especially those that have been subjected to sexual misconduct, sexual harassment, and sexual assault. And at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we are bringing about the change that will make sure that women and men can work together, knowing that they are respected, that they are equals, and that they are safe in that work environment. Serving in the Canadian Armed Forces is dangerous enough as it is, and the tasks that we expect them to undertake. And the last thing that they should ever have to be fighting is sexual misconduct within the forces. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bazan. On to Mr. Baker, please.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. And I would like to speak to what Mr. Bazan just said. He spoke to doing the right things by the members of the armed forces, and I'd like to speak to that a little bit. Every day, Canadian Armed Forces members across the globe risk their lives to support us, our allies, partners, and friends, and to uphold values that we hold dear as Canadians: peace, freedom, and respect for the dignity of all people. But our government's is aware that it has not lived up to its responsibility to protect members from misconduct. Over the past months, we have heard from Canadian Armed Forces members affected by sexual trauma and sexual misconduct. And we have heard from them at this very committee. They have shared their heart-wrenching accounts, and we have carefully listened to them. And now they believe in us to take action as a committee. Canadian Armed Forces members make enormous sacrifices to protect Canadians, and regardless of rank or gender, have an undeniable right to serve in safety. When allegations of misconduct are brought forward, proper processes have to be followed. As the minister has always stated, he has always followed those processes when allegations were brought to his attention. And this is something he will continue to do. In fact, when it comes to the General Vance allegations, the minister followed the same steps the previous government took when they heard of such allegations in 2015. Then we learned of troubling news a couple of days ago. We learned from Global News reporting that Prime Minister Harper appointed General Vance in July of 2015, even though he was still under active investigation by the Canadian Forces National Investigation Service. Just days after the former government appointed him, the investigation was suddenly dropped. According to an ATIP, the commanding officer said he was under, quote, pressure, close quote. This is extremely concerning. Investigations conducted by the CFNIS need to be free from any sort of political influence or pressure. And this raises substantial questions as to who was behind the pressure. If the Conservative government pushed the investigation to be ended on the very day Vance was appointed, and if the investigation was done appropriately. The current leader of the opposition, Mr. O'Toole, says he passed along sexual misconduct allegations about General Vance in July 2015, claiming those were looked into. And I asked my fellow members, how is that possible if General Vance was appointed at that time and the investigation was suddenly dropped? Additionally, the order in council for the appointment was signed months earlier, on April 27th, 2015. These are things that are well worth the time of this committee and that Mr. O'Toole himself should come clean on. I wonder if this is something my colleagues would like to address. However, regardless of the opposition's petty political games and actions, I think our government has shown that we are dedicated to creating lasting culture change across the defense team. In fact, throughout this process, including the work that we have been doing at this committee, the Department of National Defense has continuously heard from organizations and individuals that we must do more to support people when they've been harmed. And the minister was clear. The minister was clear. We are truly sorry to every person in the Department of National Defense who has been affected by sexual harassment and violence and felt that they weren't supported. We also, through the testimonies that we have heard, know that the current reporting systems do not mention time and time again by both experts and by survivors. Now, our government recognizes that we must transform the culture of the defense team to one of dignity and respect, and that we need to put in place an external reporting system outside of the chain of command to begin rebuilding confidence. These changes have to be comprehensive, and most importantly, they have to be lasting. The changes must also address the systemic challenges at the root of the problem that are abuses of power, discrimination, biases, and harmful stereotypes. And that's why yesterday, the Minister of National Defense announced that Madame Louise Arbour, former Supreme Court Justice, has agreed to lead an independent external comprehensive review of our institutional policies and culture. Over the coming months, the Minister expects Madame Arbour to provide concrete recommendations on how the Canadian Armed Forces and the Department of National Defense can set up an independent external reporting system for defense team members that meets the needs of those who have been impacted by sexual misconduct. As mentioned during yesterday's announcement, this system needs to be focused on those who have been impacted by misconduct, be responsive to their needs, and be outside of the chain of command in the Department of National Defense. And unlike the opposition who is busy playing political games, we are taking robust action, something survivors not only asked us to do, but expect us to do. Now, Madame Arbour and her team will provide significant direction on how the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces must evolve to support affected people and how we can ensure that every incident is handled appropriately. This is something that has been called for a while now, and we're making it happen. Part of this work also includes looking at the current structures of the Canadian Armed Forces, the Department of National Defense, and the Sexual Misconduct Response Center to see how they can be strengthened so that they can provide greater confidence to those who need support. Madame Arbour will also examine performance evaluation and promotion system in the Canadian Armed Forces with a focus on how leaders are selected and trained. This review, as the minister stated yesterday, will also look at the military justice system's policies, procedures, and practices to see how we can make this system more responsive to the needs of those who have experienced misconduct while holding perpetrators accountable. And as Madame Arbour works, she'll be able to provide interim recommendations that the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces are committed to acting upon. Meanwhile, the department will continue to work with the defense team to create a new organization, the Chief of Professional Conduct and Culture. Under the leadership of Lieutenant General Jenny Carignan, this team will be responsible for creating the conditions for cultural transformation by unifying, integrating, and coordinating our government's ongoing efforts across the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces. Their goal is ensuring that the actions and behaviors of all defense members reflect the very best parts of the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces. Lieutenant General Carignan and her team's efforts will closely align with the work being carried out by the external review. They will be informed by best practices as well as experts, advocates, and those with lived experience inside and outside of the Department of National Defense, the Canadian Armed Forces, and at all levels. This is something that will bring clarity to all our defense team members. We have taken a step in the recognition of members and veterans who have military sexual trauma. And with the $236 million in funding, which was in budget, the budget introduced, the budget 2021, our government will work with Veterans Affairs Canada to develop a peer support network for Canadian Armed Forces members and veterans affected by sexual assault or sexual harassment during their service. This is something that we have heard survivors asking about, and we're delivering on it. During yesterday's announcement, the minister stated that our government is funding peer-to-peer support online and in person, as well as expanding the reach of the Sexual Misconduct Response Center across the country, as noted in the budget 2021. This program will include both online and in-person group support, as well as an app that will connect members to confidential peer support 24/7 anywhere across the globe. It will be designed and facilitated by professionals, clinicians, and people with lived experience, ensuring the very best support is available for all defense team members. Throughout the past months, we have been hard at work, and yesterday's announcement shows just that. We have spent countless hours at this committee on this study, and I truly hope that this committee too can contribute to making things better for all Canadian Armed Forces members. I'm looking forward to getting to the reporting stages to share this committee's recommendations and share the substantial work we've been doing. Going back to the funding in budget 2021, it will also ensure that our government will continue our efforts to implement the Declaration of Victims' Rights in our military justice system. The Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces is currently consulting with victims groups and will soon launch an online questionnaire to solicit anonymous feedback so we can implement the regulations needed for Bill C-77. Taken together, I think everyone can agree that these initiatives are critical to building a true culture of inclusion where everyone is treated with dignity and with respect. But as the Minister of National Defense stated yesterday, these are just the first steps, and the Department of National Defense and Canadian Armed Forces is committed to a lasting change, one that sheds the toxic and outdated values, practices, and policies that have harmed our brave women and men in uniform. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, the version that we circulated of the motion had an omission in English. The French was correct. So just wanted to put on the record, and I believe that the corrected version of the motion was sent to the clerk, but at the end of it, it should also read, and that the witness be called to testify within that's wrong. Just hang on. Too many files. It reads after this motion passing, and that the timelines for completing the study remain unchanged. As I said before, the French version that was tabled was correct, and there was just a omission at the end of the English.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Madame Romanato.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That isn't a point of order. That is the member reading out his motion that he already read out, and therefore that is not an admissible point of order.
I would disagree on that, Madam Chair, because it was, I just want to make sure the wording is correct. That is ordered for the debate that is pursuing right now is based upon the motion that was tabled. I want to make sure that the correct version was in the hands of committee members. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Bazan. We'll talk to the clerk, but we can let our next speakers carry on while we just clarify this. It's Mr. Spengeman next, then followed by Mr. Garrison. Go ahead, Mr. Spengeman.
Madam Chair, thank you very much, and I appreciate the motion. Mr. Bazan has every right to bring it. I would like to give the committee my reflections in response to that motion on where I think we are and what this case is fundamentally all about. I'd like to echo the comments by my colleague, Mr. Baker, brought a few minutes ago with respect to the importance of the work of this committee and what's ahead of us and the expectations that Canadians have for this committee to invest itself in the formulation of recommendations that will lead to real change in the culture that we have heard so much about. Madam Chair, fundamentally, I think this is about power, and specifically it's about the abuse of power and against primarily female serving members or former serving members of the Canadian Forces. Jonathan Vance is reported to have said in a recent article in the Ottawa Citizen dated April 22nd, is reported to have boasted that he was, and the quote is, untouchable by military police. He bragged about, quote unquote, owning the Canadian Forces National Investigation Service, or CFNIS. And Jonathan Vance was appointed by former Prime Minister Harper and his cabinet, which then included the leader of the official opposition, Erin O'Toole, in his then capacity of Veterans Affairs Minister. We've just heard from my colleague, Mr. Baker, that General Vance was still under active investigation at the time of his appointment. And his tenure then extended into the current government under Prime Minister Trudeau. And during the latter part of his tenure, that latter part until most recently, in every instance, there was no actionable evidence. There were rumors, but nothing that was actionable. Madam Chair, it's important to note that Jonathan Vance did not create the harmful culture in the Canadian Forces, but he was a beneficiary of it and he exploited it. And again, this is about power. It's about the abuse of power, and it's power, the exercise of power that has greatly harmed each individual victim and, in my submission, the Canadian Forces as a whole. The solutions then will have to be about effective oversight. They will have to be about investigative mechanisms, accountability, and ultimately culture change. And oversight, Madam Chair, falls into two components. There's internal oversight and external oversight. In my last submissions at the last session we had on this, I made reference to the fact that a number of our friends and allies, other countries around the world, are going through very similar questions and processes, some of which are helpful and illuminating to our work. And then just very recently, literally in the last 24 hours, with respect to internal oversight, there's a Hill article referring to developments in the U.S. That says that retired Admiral Michael Mullen who is involved in the examination of this issue on the U.S. side, says that he now supports removing commanders from sexual assault prosecutions. He's quoted as saying, "I'm at a point now where I'm ready to support removal, which is a huge step for me because I recognize how serious the issue is." He told Politico, "We can't just keep doing what we're doing because it hasn't worked." Mullen's comments come after Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, a Democrat from New York, on Thursday released a bill with bipartisan support that would take away the power of military commanders to decide if a sexual assault case should be prosecuted. The bill would give specially trained military prosecutors the reins in navigating sexual assault cases. Many lawmakers have changed their minds on this issue and have come to support Gillibrand's proposal, but Mullins is particularly impactful as he is the former chair of the Joint Chiefs and is a top advisor to Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin in the U.S. And Madam Chair, I raised that example because there are ideas, there are solutions that are coming at us from other jurisdictions. I'm hopefully going to have a chance to make some other submissions later on in the committee's work today. But it's also important to recognize that with respect to internal oversight, we need to support the allies, the serving members of the Canadian Forces, male and female, who are prepared to speak out, who recognize this to be an issue, and who are fighting for change inside the Canadian Forces. Now, clearly, internal oversight has not been enough. As we saw, the former Chief of Defence Staff claimed that he was owning the CFNIS, so internal oversight would fall flat if we take that at face value. So with respect to external or civilian oversight, Madam Chair, the committee has learned from witnesses virtually uniformly across the testimony that elected officials, including prime ministers and ministers, cannot launch or oversee investigations. That is simply inappropriate to do so in Canada because we're founded on a system that is supported by the separation of powers. So if the military investigative service in Canada, due to the constellation of internal power structures, can indeed be owned by a particular Chief of Defence Staff, then external mechanisms need to be explored so that victims can indeed be empowered to come forward. And Minister Sajjan has been very clear across his 6 hours of testimony before this committee. He said that the time for patience is over. And that is the call to action for us as members of this particular committee. The work of this committee fundamentally includes the development of recommendations for urgent structural changes to break down the harmful culture of sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces. And colleagues, Madam Chair, why is this work so critically important? There are, as in many cases involving work on justice, work on gender equality, two components of that. The first and most important is the moral component, the rights of women. Sexual misconduct simply is wrong. It cannot be sustained. We cannot be accepting of the fact or the idea that there will be more victims going forward. There's a second component that we've talked about in this Parliament and with respect to equity, diversity and inclusion also in the former Parliament where this committee conducted a study, and colleagues who are on the current committee have also been part of that study. And that's the conclusion, Madam Chair, that the Canadian Forces will be better in the field when we overcome the culture of sexual misconduct. It is about sexual misconduct today inside the armed forces, but unless we extinguish this culture, there are risk points in the interaction of Canadian Armed Forces members with other militaries in their field work, in their alliances with NATO or inside the UN. And there are also risk points vis-a-vis the behavior of members of the armed forces vis-a-vis civilian populations. So there is that second instrumental component. Not only do we need to prevent any form of misconduct or sexual violence or abuse against women, but equally, once we've overcome it, the Canadian Forces will be a stronger, a better organization. Much work has been done on that second point. The Geneva Center for the Democratic Control of the Armed Forces, as it was once known that I've referred to in the previous session, or now the Geneva Center for Security Governance, has done extensive research and reporting, and again has a plethora of recommendations that may be helpful to this committee going forward. But let me just finish with the thought, Madam Chair, that Mr. Bazan has said that he's seeking to respect the timelines, but really what we're looking at now is another session being proposed, another single witness being called in the hopes by the Conservatives that this will take them somewhere in their largely political argument. We're running out of runway to formulate the recommendations that this committee really needs to make, that Canadians need to hear in parallel with the work of Madam Justice Arbour, as my colleague Mr. Baker has outlined. And for that reason, in my submission, Madam Chair, we should embark on that work. And I've yet to hear from Mr. Bazan any recommendations or reactions to the recommendations that my colleagues and I have put forward with respect to how we actually change this culture. Let's take that work seriously. Let's prioritize it, and let's achieve the changes that are so urgently needed. And I'll leave it there for the submission, but we'll probably come back with more detail afterwards. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spengeman. It's up next is Mr. Garrison, followed by Monsieur Barcelou-Duval. Go ahead, Mr. Garrison.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm going to make fairly extensive remarks here because of my great disappointment as to where we are, both as a committee and as a country, on the issue of sexual misconduct in the Canadian military. I want to start by saying I'm very disappointed to hear the Prime Minister refer to sexual misconduct complaints as Me Too complaints, and to hear that terminology echoed by other members in other parties. The Me Too hashtag was created in the United States among survivors so that they could connect with each other and not feel alone in their suffering from sexual misconduct or sexual assault. When we take Me Too out of that context of survivors and others use it, either perpetrators or those who have a responsibility for acting, I believe that it inadvertently perhaps diminishes the importance of those complaints. It's a function of the language being used. So I hope that we would, in this debate, focus squarely on the correct and accurate term here, which is sexual misconduct, and leave the term Me Too for its original purpose, to express solidarity among survivors. And I think language is very important because I think it illustrates and demonstrates whether we as members of parliament understand the nature of sexual misconduct and understand the nature of the question we're dealing with. My second disappointment comes whenever the Liberals and Conservatives get involved in a debate about who failed survivors first or who failed survivors more. This does not serve the interest of survivors in any way, and I cast blame equally in both directions here. We did hear from the Chief of Staff, however, to the former Conservative Prime Minister, and in parallel, I think we should also hear the Chief of Staff from the current Prime Minister. But I don't think it is effective for us to engage in arguments that do comparative failure. We have failed the survivors of sexual assault in the Canadian military. All of us have failed them by not getting policies in place, not just to support them, because that's, I think, if you will, looking at the wrong end of the problem, but to change the culture and prevent there being such an inordinately large number of victims of sexual assault in the Canadian military. Third way in which I'm disappointed is that we haven't seen action on recommendations made by Madame Deschamps. Now, I will say I have the utmost respect for Madame Arbour, and I believe that she will provide additional and valuable advice to a government which clearly needs that advice. But in the interim, while we wait, there are things that could and should have been done. And the members of the Liberal Party on this committee will argue that we need to get on to those things. But I am also disappointed when we forget that the question of trust is central to any changes that we're going to be recommending in the future. And so if women serving in the Canadian Forces, and indeed men serving in the Canadian Forces, don't trust that there is understanding at the highest level on sexual misconduct and that there will be action at the highest level, then I fear that any reforms made will have very little credibility, very little trust, and any system set up will not be used by those survivors. So we have to answer that question of why no action was taken. Why, when General Vance was accused of sexual misconduct more than one time, as we now clearly know, but why in 2018, when this went forward to the Minister of Defense, was there no investigation completed? Let's look at results, not process. You can talk about where things were referred and who they were referred to, but the fact is no investigation was completed. And the fact is that General Vance remained not only as Chief of Defense Staff, but in charge of Operation Honor, which was to root out sexual misconduct in the Canadian military. And so we need the answer to that question. The Prime Minister himself in his press conference told us who he believes has that answer. So the Minister of Defense says, and his defense is, I referred it to the Prime Minister's office. The Prime Minister was supposed to take care of it. And so what we need to know now from the Prime Minister's office, if it is in fact true that the information was not correctly conveyed to them, that this was an accusation of sexual misconduct. The evidence we have heard in committee seems to point very clearly to the fact that if they did not know, they should have known. But again, the Prime Minister pointed it to his Chief of Staff in his comments as the one who has the answer to that question. And for that reason, I will be supporting this motion. This is not dragging out the hearings. This is getting a final witness who the Prime Minister himself has said has the answer to the question that we need to answer in order to restore trust that those at the highest level, both in the Canadian Forces and in the government, both understand and will act on cases of sexual misconduct. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Garrison. On to Monsieur Barcelou-Duval, followed by Madame Romanado. Go ahead, Monsieur Barcelou-Duval.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to first of all acknowledge the message sent by my colleague from the NDP, Mr. Garrison. His discourse was very eloquent, and it brings us to a higher level, but it does not show any voluntary self-blinding given the situation. I think that the interpreter is sorry, but the sound quality is not sufficient to continue for the moment. We hope this brief technical difficulty will be resolved soon owing to an excess of background noise. Unfortunately, we will have to suspend the interpretation for a few moments. Is it a problem of translation, Madam Chair? It's a matter of background noise interfering with the sound quality.
We're in difficult times with COVID-19, and many have family responsibilities, and I think it would be really not right that if somebody has a child and there's background noise of necessity, that that individual not be able to speak in this committee because of that. I know that it's difficult for the interpreters, but I do think that we have to be very understanding of family, and that is not something that should ever stop a member from being able to participate in debate.
Okay, thank you, Madame Vanderbilt. And I was wondering the same, what that was. But Monsieur Barcelou-Duval, if you could, maybe just slow down a little bit because the interpreters are having a hard time. If you slow down a bit, maybe they'll be able to catch more of it. But I think it's very important that we hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As a matter of fact, I have my son at home with me. Unfortunately, COVID means that we cannot always find babysitters all the time, so it can cause little complications. I hope it won't cause too much inconvenience. I'll be careful not to speak too quickly, and in spite of everything, maintain my discourse. I think it's important for us to get to the bottom of things and really understand what happened, and that's why I support the motion, because the witness who is being requested, Ms. Thetford, the Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister, would be able to clarify this matter. And I think that it's important for people to have the impression when we wind up this study that we don't do things halfway or cut corners. And I find it important for us to get the maximum that we can to have a report for the victims, and I think it will not prevent us from making efforts as a committee to be able to provide recommendations for the victim and do our work appropriately. I would also like to add my sincere disappointment concerning the way things are advancing in recent weeks, where we have the impression that the government and the Prime Minister are adjusting facts as we go along and as the witnesses appear before the committee. And it's not the kind of thing that builds trust, unfortunately. And whether there are things to be blamed for or not, I think that it's a matter of transparency to put the cards on the table when serious situations such as this occur. So this is why I have no intention of dropping this. I see a lot of people have had things to say during the meeting today. It will be a pleasure, of course, for me to listen to each of the committee members, but I hope that we will nevertheless ultimately be able to make a decision today, because I think it's also in the interest of everyone for us to be able to advance in our work as a committee, and for our committee work not to be obstructed by a desire perhaps to avoid some witnesses being able to appear. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I look forward to hearing the different colleagues.
All right. Merci, Monsieur Barcelou.
Thank you, Mr. Barcel-Duval.
Romanado, followed by Mr. Bagnall. Go ahead, Madame Romanado.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Premièrement, Monsieur Barcelou.
First of all, Mr. Barcel-Duval, it's always a pleasure to hear your son. You should never have to apologize for having your son there.
MP Garrison for his words. I'm subbing in here today, and I haven't been part of the study, but I think that's something that seems to have gotten forgotten along the way. If the goal of this committee and the members of this committee is to provide a report with recommendations to finally stamp out sexual harassment in the military, that's great. And I think every member of the Canadian Armed Forces and the families that support them wants us to come together to finally come up with a solution for this, a concrete solution. If the point of this is literally to get content for social media, well, then shame on you. When I decided to run for office, my son, who joined the forces in 2011, and the younger one, who joined in 2013, I was really concerned as a military mom, and many of you who on this committee who served with me in the last parliament know that. And the reason I decided to run is because, you know why? I was a ticked off mom. I was worried that if my kids got sick or injured in the Canadian Armed Forces, that they wouldn't be taken care of when they left. And I said, you know, I can put up or I could shut up. So I got involved, and I decided to run for federal office because I was not happy on how we were treating our veterans and members of our forces. When my kids joined the forces, and my colleague MP Alice Lev and the chair will know this, the family joins. It's the whole family is involved, right? And you hear stuff, you know, you talk about stuff and you get worried. You start thinking about things and you hope things will change. And you get involved and you get active. I now have another member of the Canadian Armed Forces in my family. My son married a member of the Canadian Armed Forces. So I've got my own little platoon going on over here. But I'm really concerned. The Deschamps report clearly brought forward the problems in the Canadian Armed Forces. And as MP Garrison said, we had a duty. We all have a duty to act. We can stand here and beat our chest and blame each other, who did what, who didn't do what. But it's what we do moving forward. How do we fix this? Those survivors, the families that support them, that went through horrible experiences, need us to move forward. They need us to come together as a collective and move the dial. I ask that we come together, get this done for them. So I don't want to have to hear that one of my kids went through this. I don't want to have to bury another family member or friend of a Canadian Armed Forces. I don't want to hear that anymore. I don't want to go to any more funerals. I want to know that we did something. I don't know about you guys, but that's why I ran. I was once told you either run for office because you want to do something or because you want to be someone. I don't know about you guys, but I want to do something. So let's get this report finalized. Let's hear with who we got to hear from, but let's get it done. You know, I don't know what the regular practice is for National Defense Committee with respect to submitting witnesses. In my committee, if a member wants to submit a witness, they submit it to the clerk and we just invite them. We don't 106.4 and have these debates on a witness. Just send in the witness. To me, this sounds like political grandstanding. You're playing games. If you really want to just have someone come to committee, send in your witness list. Get the people here, speak to them, get it done. But stop playing games for the sake of getting political points. This is not what we're supposed to be doing. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madame Romanado. On to Mr. Bagnall, followed by Madame Vanderbilt. You're on mute, Mr. Bagnall.
Should have learned that by now. Thank you, Madam Chair, very much. And I really appreciate Ms. Romando being here because comes from a military family and could have a lot more input than I would have knowledge of, and I really appreciate that. And she said passionately we should get on with doing the recommendations. Mr. Baker and I say that at the beginning. So that's what I'm going to spend most of my comments on today. But as we know, the investigation was there was a complaint. Investigation was done as far as any information was available, and that was carried on. And then this, as several members have mentioned already, information came out this week that's changed the whole focus of the General Vance situation. If you want to follow that, I don't think victims, they want us to get on and do the report and make the changes. So that's what I'm going to mostly concentrate on. There's hundreds of victims, hundreds of perpetrators. And if we spend our time, we've already spent more than enough time on Mr. Vance, on one of those hundreds, which is being investigated in the proper channels anyways. And the investigation of the one complaint was complete at the time as far as it could be done. So as the member said, the focus has actually changed. If we were going to pursue that, which I'm not suggesting at this time, the much more serious news has come out that Mr. Vance was appointed while he was still under investigation, and that could lead to all sorts of witnesses around that situation. But as I said before, that's not my focus right now. I want to carry on like I did before about talking about things that will help the witnesses. The minister has made some very major steps. There's a lot more to be done, but this week, and Mr. Baker touched on those, and I will go into those at great depth, but not right now. Because I want to get back to where the second part of what I was doing the last time, when we're making the case that there's enough information available, both from victims and reports, to do a really good job of helping the victims now, who must think a pox on all our houses if we don't move forward and suggest to the minister, who's already taking steps, but we could give him more authority to take more steps if we had our recommendations done. But before I get on to that, what I want to do, the second half of what I did at the last meeting, I did want to comment on what's been done so far. There was suggestions about trust and confidence at the top, and I think that's important. And I think that the minister has done so much. Parliamentary timelines are You know, you have to act quickly to get things done. And I think with the present minister, the number of things he has done gives that confidence and trust to, if we're going to get something done, that he's going to do as much as he can. And I'll just remind some of the people that may not be too familiar with this subject, including some of the great national media who I really appreciate. They do some excellent research, but I haven't noticed as much on the steps to date. And obviously we have to do more, which has always been the focus of my discussions. But some of the steps the present minister, long before any of this came up, said he was ensuring that our support and our approach was victim-centric. It meant that victims be supported throughout the process. It meant the establishment of a case management system to ensure cases are investigated and resolved in a timely manner. He said it involved the increased training from experts that is victim-centric and accessible to all CAF members, no matter where they work. And it will build on some of the important work already underway, a review of the unfounded cases, which is important both inside and outside the military, a passing of C-77, a declaration of victim rights that puts the victims at the core of the military justice system. And he made it clear long ago that we owe it to our women and men in uniform to get this right. On the sexual misconduct, and I appreciate Mr. Garrison's comments on the wording. The government took allegations seriously, and the minister said no one should feel unsafe at work. But he also said there's a lot of work to do, as I think all committee members agree today. But that's why he launched the Path to Dignity and Respect, a strategy for long-term cultural change to eliminate sexual misconduct within the Canadian Armed Forces. And made a very strong statement that mission here is nothing less than cultural change. And we should not stop until our members are able to perform the duties in an environment free from harassment and discrimination. And on C-77, says the government takes the allegations very seriously. No one should feel unsafe at work. And that's why Bill C-77, a declaration of victim rights, was passed that puts the victim at the core of the military justice system. We also, the minister said, we also promised to consult victims as we draft the regulations for this bill, and it's exactly what is being done. So far, he has consulted federal partners, including Sexual Misconduct Response Center, the SMRC, and are developing an online survey to consult as many victims as possible. And as you know, some of the feedback has shown about, as I said at the beginning, hundreds and hundreds of perpetrators and victims. So we owe it to our men and women to get it right. The minister said time and time again before this started that inappropriate sexual behavior of any kind is completely unacceptable and will not be tolerated. Every person who willingly serves their country, despite the many dangers and sacrifices of military service, deserves a professional environment in which they are treated with respect and dignity. And the Canadian Forces continues to take definitive action to address and eliminate sexual misconduct. But obviously, we need more work to do, and we heard from the victims at great length. And I think they've said we've got the information from them and the steps we can take. And frankly, that's what we should be discussing now. And some of them have expressed their appreciation for us getting some more of that on the record. And at the last time I was speaking, I talked about the Deschamps report. There was 2 parts. First, there was on sexual misconduct. First, there was a section on sexual harassment, which I covered the last time I spoke. And then the second part of that is on sexual assault. So to continue our position that we have enough information, that there's a lot that we could be working on right now that's very important to the victims. I'm going to continue that information to make sure it's on the record, to make sure that victims know that we're thinking about them, about the things that have been found out so far, and that the actions that need to be made forward, taken forward. So as a preliminary matter, the ERA noted that as part of its mandate, it has been requested to consider and make recommendations concerning the following: the adequacy of the definition of sexual misconduct as provided for in DOAD 5019.5. And I discussed that at length at a previous meeting, how the directives have made some very good changes, very comprehensive changes. But I'm not sure why those aren't working. And that's what we have to be discussing.
Madam Chair, point of order.
Go ahead, Madame Gallant.
Okay, so Madam Chair, I thought this meeting was about debating the motion and bringing a witness in for our next meeting so we can finish this study. I did not realize that we were already into the phase of the report where we're actually making the recommendations. I believe when we go to actually compose the report, that is when we go over these recommendations. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you,
Madam. On the point of order.
Go ahead.
On the point of.
Go ahead, Mr. Bagnall.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we've already made this case. It's already been deemed relevant in the previous meeting when people were trying to extend the meeting way beyond the time to discuss things that were not the recommendations. So I'll just continue on with that rationale and that approval.
Point of order, Madam Chair. Just that Mr. Bagnall's reading the same script that he used in the last filibuster, so this is repetition.
No, as a matter of fact, sorry, to correct the member, this is totally new. I've never read this. So, and I've never got these important points about the victims to show that we have the information that we need to move forward, that we need to be discussing, instead of constantly calling more victims on one particular case. General Vance, as I said, there's a lot more witnesses that are more important now that we found critical new information this week about his appointment. But that's not where with the people, the victims that have been so sadly hurt have expressed, and that's what I'm continuing. And as I said, I correct the member, I haven't said any of this before.
I would like to challenge the chair's ruling on accepting this and accepting overturning my point of order. So I want to overturn your decision.
Okay, go ahead, Madame Vanderbilt.
Yes, if the members could find where in the blues Mr. Bagnall actually said this before, then of course, but if that's not in the blues, then I believe he has the right to continue. And Madam Chair, I think you already ruled on this.
Madam Chair, I don't think the blues are out yet.
From previous meetings, the blues are out.
That meeting, they're out?
I would imagine. How long does it take?
Forever.
It's usually within a week.
And regardless, the video is always available immediately. And unless they can show that this was said before, I do think, Madam Chair, you've already ruled on this point of order.
All right, carry on, Mr. Bagnall, please.
Point of order, Madam Chair. I am putting a motion to overrule the chair's decision.
The question.
To be clear, if we vote yes, we are sustaining the chair? Okay.
Yes. If you vote yes, the decision of the chair stands. The question is, shall the decision of the chair be sustained? Mr. Bagnall.
Oui.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Madame Romanado,
Oui.
Mr. Spangerman,
En faveur?
Ms. Vanden Bell,
Yes.
Mr. Benson,
No.
Mr. Bizan,
No.
Ms. Alislav,
No.
Ms. Gallant,
No.
M. Barcelo Dubal,
Je vais abstenir.
Mr. Garrison,
No.
five yeas and 5 nays. So it's your decision.
All right, carry on, Mr. Bagnall, please.
Pardon me. What was the
thank you.
outcome? Did somebody vote yes?
5 yeas and 5 nays.
It's 5
And
yeas
in the
and 5
event-
nays.
Yes. And in the event of an equality of voices, the chair's decision is sustained.
Thank you. And I think this is consistent with what happens in most committees. There's certainly leeway for members to express themselves on matters that in the context. And the context is that we're discussing something that would extend the meeting to an area where I think that it's less productive than the dealing with the information that victims have provided, the serious situations they've been through, and that is what we should really be discussing for those, as Mr. Bizan and Madam Romanano said, is where our focus should be right now. So I'll just continue where I left off, that the adequacy of CAF policies, procedures, and programs relating to sexual misconduct, the training of CAF members in relation to sexual misconduct, the resources dedicated to the implementation of the policies, procedures, and programs in relation to sexual misconduct, the extent at which CAF members report alleged incidents of sexual misconduct for any reasons, why reporting may not occur, including the role of military culture and the chain of command. And as I've mentioned earlier, some of the numbers about the huge numbers of incidences that have been mentioned in surveys, but there were not challenges or charges put forward. People were afraid to come forward. So that's why that's so important that we should be discussing that. And any other matter that the ERA considers relevant in assisting CAF to strengthen the prevention of incidents of sexual misconduct. As discussed above, sexual assault is included in the definition of misconduct. And consistent with this mandate, through the 6-month fact-finding process, the ERA conducted interviews with members and civilian employees responsible for the implementation of CAF policies on sexual misconduct, including members of the JAG office, the CFNIS branch of the military police, the regulatory military police service, and the military prosecution service. In addition, the CAF shared with the ERA relevant policies, protocols, and documents related to sexual misconduct. With the efficient support of the DMP, representatives of the JAG and CAF bases and DND coordinators, as much information as possible was gathered in order for the ERA to fulfill the terms of the mandate. This said, the ERA's mandate contains an express limitation which requires some comment. The mandate states that ERA shall not review any matter related to the Judge Advocate General, the JAG, in respect of his or her superintendents of the administration of military justice in the Canadian Forces. A question arises as to what is captured by the JAG's superintendents of administration of military justice, and therefore falls outside the scope of the review. And 2 interpretations may be offered, and this is something that could be pursued by this committee. Under the broad interpretation of the limitation merely discussing sexual misconduct, the investigation of which falls under both military and civilian jurisdiction would be excluded by this limitation. The consequence would be that most of the references to sexual misconduct in the mandate would be moot. Such broad interpretation of the limitation would therefore result in the exclusion of a large and explicit part of the mandate. Not only is such an interpretation at odds with plain language reading of the mandate, but it also contradicts the way in which CAF itself interpreted the mandate during the course of the review. In fact, most of the interviewees involved in the implementation of the policies, procedures, and programs of sexual misconduct would not have been available to the ERA if their role was not relevant to the gist of the mandate. A narrow interpretation of the limitation is more respectful of the text of the mandate, the respective responsibilities of the JAG and of the Provost Marshal, and the way in which CAF interpreted the mandate in the course of the review. The JAG is commissioned officer appointed by the Governor and Council to superintend the administration of military justice. To ensure the independence of military justice system, the JAG reports to the Minister of Defense and not to the CAF. Among the JAG's responsibilities relevant to this review in relation to the administration of military justice, the JAG is responsible for court-martial and summary trials. The effective limitation in the ERA's mandate is therefore to exclude from review the JAG's oversight of court-martial proceedings and summary trial. By contrast, responsibility for the military police rests with the Canadian Forces Provost Marshal, who serves as the commander of the Canadian Forces Military Group. Whereas the JAG is independent of CAF, the Provost Marshal reports to the Vice Chief of Defense Staff, which, as we've heard, and which Ms. Arbour will address hopefully in her recommendations on the restructuring, which is a huge job, which I hope to comment on later. But change is very, very difficult when you're making major changes like this. So her expertise will be excellent in proceeding on that. As such, the ERA's mandate encompasses a review of the conduct of military police, including the CFNIS, vis-a-vis incidents of sexual misconduct. This includes the policy and procedures by which the military police receive complaints of sexual misconduct, communicate provide support to victims, and exercise their discretion as to which organization the MPs, the SFN, the CFNIS, or civilian police should or will investigate such allegations. Given that the CDS did in fact direct the policies, procedures, and programs related to sexual misconduct are to be the subject of meaningful review, the narrow interpretation of the limitation must be favored. As such, the ERA makes no comment with respect to court-martials or summary trials. However, the ERA's mandate clearly encompasses a review of the policies, procedures, and programs that have been adopted by the CAF with respect to the investigation of and laying charges for sexual misconduct by the military police. So that limitation is something else that the committee and Ms. Arbour, if the committee does not raise it, could look into. Until recently, the complaints related to the CAF members that involved sexual assaults and which occurred in Canada were normally investigated by civilian police, and all charges for such allegations were prosecuted before the civilian courts. This changed in 1998, however, when Parliament amended the National Defence Act to also allow the military justice system to handle charges of sexual assault. Under the shared jurisdiction, approximately half the cases investigated by CFNIS are referred to the civilian justice system for a number of reasons, such as they involve cadets who are not subject to the CDS, civilian victims, or incidents of the family violence, etc. As a consequence, even if a matter of the military police policy, the military justice system takes priority over the civilian system, the sharing jurisdiction is a reality. Military police operate on CAF property and outside Canada during contingency and expeditionary circumstances. When the military police is informed of an incident involving sexual assault, they notify the Canadian Forces National Investigation Services, which has jurisdiction over all sexual assaults. The CFNIS consists of members of the military police who are organized as an independent unit. It has jurisdiction over serious and sensitive offenses, including sexual assault. When the CFNIS receives a report of sexual assault, it determines whether it will exercise it in an investigative manner or it will refer its jurisdiction back to the reporting military police unit. In practice, the CFNIS generally turns sexual assault incidents over to the military police where no penetration has occurred. If the CFNIS determines it will turn jurisdiction over to the local military police, the military police can exercise their discretion as to whether or not the case will be pursued, following the same procedures as exist for other charges. And as we heard in some of the victim testimony, there was not confidence in a number of cases that it was or would be pursued. So notably in determining whether or not charges should proceed, the military police consult with the chain of command, which is another problem that we should be discussing in great depth right now. By contrast, if the CFNIS has carriage over the matter, it may lay charges without having to consult the chain of command. According to comments made by Brigadier General Pitzel several years after the CAF assumed jurisdiction over sexual assaults, the justification for allowing the military to deal with sexual assault is that such offenses can have a detrimental impact on cohesion within a unit and therefore should be treated in a similar manner to other offenses that may have the same effect. And all those offenses, I think, will be looked at in our upcoming study on the military justice, which hopefully we will get to soon. General Pitzel's comment is consistent with the purpose of creating a separate system of military justice as described by Justice Lammer in R versus Generou. The purpose of a separate military system of military tribunals is to allow the armed forces to deal with matters that pertain directly to the discipline, efficiency, and morale of the military. The military must be in a position to enforce internal discipline effectively and efficiently. Breaches of military discipline must be dealt with speedily and frequently, punished more severely than would be the case if a civilian is engaged in such contact. And there has been testimony that that's not necessarily what always happens. Unfortunately, victims of sexual assault have not reaped the benefits hoped for under the new jurisdiction. Victims criticize the lack of training of the military police, poor support by the chain of command, and inconsistency with the charges of sexual assault that are ultimately sanctioned. And these are the serious types of things that we should, moving forward, quickly doing a report right now, making recommendations on these serious items that affect hundreds of present members in the military and, of course, the past members who are victims. While civilian law enforcement, prosecutor authorities, and courts have been criticized for their conduct of sexual assault cases, there is strong perception among members of the CAF that the way in which military handles such cases is the cause of added prejudice to the victim. So then they go on to discuss the treatment of victims. Many participants complained about problems in reporting and investigation surface. Criticisms by contributors and interviewees touched on many aspects of the process, starting with the failure to call the military police in a timely way when a report of sexual assault was made, to not having been offered immediate medical support, being made to feel, even before providing a statement, at fault with what had occurred, the case being held in abeyance because of confusion over jurisdiction, failure to follow up with key witnesses, and poor training with respect to investigating incidents of sexual assault. Participants criticized delays in the investigation process and having to repeatedly provide statements which required them to relive the events each time. Is that really fair? The ERA heard many examples of failings in the investigation of sexual assault, including concerns about the contamination of evidence and the frequent perception that the military police lack in their understanding of the legal concept of consent. One interviewee, referring to procedural problems in the investigation which could potentially be relied on to undermine a prosecution and secure an acquittal, commented, "Defense attorneys love CFNIS investigations because there's always issues. Such problems have resulted in a serious lack of trust in the ability of the military police to properly handle reports of sexual assault. These problems are unfortunate given that the military police are specifically warned about the consequences of sexual assault on the victims. For example, MP orders state that sexual assault is one of the most traumatic types of criminal victimization, and further, sexual assault is an act of aggression using power to control, dominate, and violate an individual. It is not an act of intimacy. And that's why I was saying earlier when I talked about the directives as to some of the appropriate directives are in place, but why is it not working? The applicable policies therefore make it clear that in the context of military life, sexual assault requires heightened attention, particularly when the aggressor is a member of the CAF family. As a sexual assault MP protocol states, sexual assault frequently includes violation of trust by those who are in a position of perceived or real power of authority. If the sentiments behind these statements were put into action and the relevant policies were implemented, many of the misgivings of the contributors would be resolved. Indeed, the ERA finds that the problem lies in the policies themselves, not in the policies themselves, but in the inadequate training, poor implementation, and members' lack of faith in the ability or interest of the military justice system to respond appropriately to instances of sexual assault. And while the ERA met with a number of dedicated and knowledgeable members of the military police, it also found that others were confused about the process, insensitive to the problems of sexual assault, lacking training of the basic elements of the offense, and unaware of the available resources. One of the problems appears to be that although policies and protocols are in place, as I've mentioned a couple of times, the number of incidents the military police system handles is far fewer than those in the civilian justice system. The various parties in the system are therefore caught in a deteriorating cycle. The way victims feel about their treatment by the military police system feeds underreporting, and underreporting leaves the military police unable to develop and maintain appropriate skills to manage these sensitive, important cases. The ERA is further concerned that less serious incidents of sexual assault are given inadequate attention and consideration. Participants in the review commented that when victims have reported less severe assaults, include unwelcome touching of breasts, buttocks, etc., they have been told by MPs that these incidents would not be prosecuted in the civilian justice system. The clear message is that the matter is not serious enough to be pursued. Whether or not such comments about the likelihood of prosecution before a civilian court are accurate, members of the CAF deserve the fuller protection of the military justice system. Unless the incident is reported an isolated and benign one where the principle of proportionality dictates restraint, sexual assaults, even those that leave no physical injury, must be taken seriously. If criminal sanctions are inappropriate, the chain of command can resort to administrative or disciplinary action to send a clear signal that the dignity of all members must be protected. Only strong sanctions through military justice, disciplinary, and administrative action will deter further assaults. Both individual and general deterrence is important. The ERA further notes that while not all assaults are of the same gravity, different victims will react differently to assault, depending on their own particular experiences and psychological makeup. While an incident of unwelcome touching may leave no psychological impact on one person, the same conduct may cause serious psychological injury to another. The thin skull principle in Canadian law makes it clear that an aggressor does not get to choose his victim. Regardless of how severe an assault, the conduct constitutes an offense under the criminal code. Discounting incidents of sexual assault where there has been no physical injury is inconsistent with Canadian law, which views psychological harm as seriously as physical harm. And I'm sure all members of the committee are totally on side and understand that and wanted to do something about that. Overall, the ERA found that the difficulties met by victims of sexual assault have a damaging effect, not only on the individual victims who do not achieve resolution to serious and traumatic incidents, but on the CAF as a whole. When the incidents of sexual assault go into unresolved, this negativity impacts the CAF both because of individual members have been harmed because it perpetuates the perception that the CAF does not take such incidents seriously. On the data collection, as I mentioned earlier, the data showing that many cases, but not many complaints. So as with sexual harassment, there's very poor collection of data regarding the incidence of sexual assault in the CAF. Since sexual assaults go widely unreported, the data does not in any way reflect the actual rate of occurrence. Even where the complaints are laid, the fact of a sexual assault more pervasive and permanent in its effect than any physical harm. I can see no principle in interpretation nor any policy reason for excluding psychological harm from the scope of section 264.1, subsection 1, subsection A of the code. Will often be buried in the court record. For example, if the accused pleads guilty to an alcohol-related charge or to conduct of prejudice in good order and discipline, only a careful review of the sentence will in some cases indicate that the conduct or underlying issue involves acts of a sexual nature.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
It just say that this isn't relevant to our motion at hand of calling Katie Telford, and I know the Liberals are more interested in protecting Mrs. Telford than protecting our armed forces, but I believe that Mr. Bagnall's got ahead of himself. Our next study will be on military justice systems and reviewing it at that point in time, and that'd be good evidence to present at that time. But on the relevance of whether or not Katie Telford should appear as a witness, I think is what is at hand today.
Well, I think the arguments are there is some argument for more witnesses and some arguments saying there's enough witnesses and there is enough testimony and recommendations. So, I mean, there's this is, you know, this really is the core of the matter. So I'm going to let Mr. Bagnall, please, Mr. Bagnall, just finish up where you are and then we'll carry on. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I don't have too much more, but I don't think any committee member that's seriously wants to help the victims think these are inappropriate information, things that where we should be at now, things that we should be discussing as opposed to the witnesses. As I said, there's a whole bunch of witnesses related to the appointment of General Vance, the serious situation before while an investigation was underway that could be called, but this doesn't help the victims. And I appreciate Mr. Bazan's comment that yes, hopefully we can have this testimony put forward to our next study, so it doesn't have to be repeated, because it would be, some of it would be very helpful. But this is the information I'm providing is related to feedback and study on sexual assault, which is related to sexual misconduct in the military, which is the exact subject of our study. So as I said, I don't have too much more to go on this section. So tracking the occurrence and outcome.
Thank you. Oh, I thought you were finished, Mr. Bagnall.
No, sorry. So tracking the occurrence and outcome of incidents of sexual assault is essential to determine the CAF policies and functioning to improve the conduct of its members, both on an individual and systematic basis. And I'll just quickly finish off here. So just in the last little bit, in any event where a case of sexual assault is referred to civilian authorities, the CAF should carry out its own parallel assessment as to whether any administrative sanctions should be imposed, for example, suspension, demolition, release of the CAF, etc. The ERA was informed that military police contains a shadow file for all incidents involving CAF members that are processed by civilian authorities. The CAF is therefore in a position to impose administrative measures on a perpetrator. The imposition of administrative sanctions is important in demonstrating the members' seriousness with the CAF. To achieve consistency in administrative measures, the CAF should establish guidelines to help COs. Factors to be taken into account determining the appropriate sanctions should include not only the personal circumstances of the offender and the nature of the incident, but the organization's overall arching goal of creating a more inclusive organizational culture that is less hostile to women and LGBTQ2. I added the two members. So as was the motivation for this input and the part A of this that I put at the previous meeting is I don't think there's any members on the committee do not think these are the serious issues we should be trying to get to the bottom of and make the most effective recommendations we can to help the minister, to give him more authority. I mean, he can and will go ahead without us. He's heard this stuff, the various input from the victims, from the Deschamps report. Ms. Arbour will make the very important recommendations to make some of the important things that we've heard during our course of this study on particularly on the independent process, but also I think that would have an effect on the repercussions related to reporting, which one of the three major items, and of course the culture. And so, as I said, there could be, if we wanted to stay on the investigation of the one General Vance investigation, one of hundreds of potential perpetrators. It's being investigated. The seriousness since 2015 because of his appointment, while there was charges, it could all those witnesses could be called. But my point I've been making since the beginning of Mr. Baker's is that we should get on with solving the serious input we've had from the victims, the structural change. As I think Ms. Romanato said, this just didn't occur recently. This is a long time systemic change, both in ours and, as Mr. Spengeman said, in many militaries. And this committee actually could be part of leading the way on solving this systemic problem from decades. If we get on with that right away and give the minister some more moral authority for the direction he's been moving in since he was appointed. And I listed at the beginning of my input a number of things that he's done, unparalleled things he's done to address sexual misconduct. And I'll continue to be very happy we can make the structural changes necessary to deal with the culture and the reporting and the independence. If I can be part of that, I'll be very, very happy. And if we don't get it done, I think all the committee members, the ones that I've heard of and have mentioned in each of their input at some time, really want to do that too. And that's the basis of my input. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bagnall. On to Madame Vandenbeld and then Mr. Spengeman and Mr. Garrison. Madame Vandenbeld.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I would just like to start in terms of just some of the things that are out there that are inaccurate about what is going on in this meeting right now for those who might be watching. First of all,
Madam Chair, I don't know if the sound system was working properly. I heard Mr. Bagnall said that charges were made in 2015 against Vance. And I don't know if he was...
that's debate, Madam Chair, and I was speaking...
No. But there were no charges that I'm aware of. Were there? Or did he mean the rumor that we acted upon as opposed to what the Liberals did was not act when an actual accusation was brought?
Madame Gallant, that's debate.
I do believe
Carry on,
floor,
Madame
Thank you.
Vandenbeld.
And I want to start by talking about some of the things that are out there that are actually not accurate about what's going on here at the committee. I know that there have been mentions by some of the opposition members of a shutdown of this committee, and I think it should be clear to those who are watching that we had a motion, and the motion was simply to get recommendations in on time so that we could actually have a report. And those recommendations have already gone in for this particular study. I would also note that there are ongoing military police investigations into the subjects of this study. This is not an investigation. We are not shutting down any investigation. That is the job of the military police. It is not the job of politicians to conduct investigations. This particular study not only has gone well beyond the initially envisaged 2 to 3 days. It's gone on almost 3 months at this point, Madam Chair. We have sat the regular hours of this committee. We've also sat 15 hours of extraordinary extra meetings on this particular study. So there has been a tremendous amount. And we've put forward witnesses who have given us very, very good recommendations that I very much hope are going to have the possibility of being tabled in the House so that the government can take action on those. I would also note that on Monday, we actually had an in-camera meeting where we studied a draft report that has been sitting since pretty much right after Christmas. And, you know, I think that it is really important that we get some of the important work of this committee done. We all submitted the names of witnesses at the beginning of the study, as is always done. And those witnesses have been heard from. And I think that at this point, to continue each time adding by motion one by one extra witnesses just to drag on this study is not actually doing anything for the women and men of the Canadian Armed Forces. I would also point out that in addition to the draft report we were looking at on CAF and COVID, we also have a draft report sitting on mental health. And we heard witnesses who gave incredibly difficult and very compelling testimony about their experiences in mental health. And it would not be doing them justice if we end up continuing to drag on this particular study well past the point where we have actually put the recommendations for the study and not get the study out on mental health, which I know that all members have some very, very powerful recommendations on that. And also, Madam Chair, we have our next planned study that I would very much like to start right away is on military justice. And we have heard from survivors, we have heard from academics, from members of the CAF. We have heard that the military justice system is very much the key to trying to reform the experiences that women and men have when they come forward. And we even heard, Madam Chair, in the Status of Women Committee, which, by the way, also studied this and also heard from all of the witnesses that were put forward by all parties. And frankly, there was some incredibly powerful testimony in that Status of Women Committee. And I hope that that committee, too, will be putting forward recommendations. But even Major Kelly Brennan in the Status of Women Committee said in her remarks that her third truth is the military, now I'm quoting now, is the military justice system needs reform. How we conduct military investigations, how we often re-victimize the women who have the courage to come forward. And my focus would be on education and making sure that the people who investigate can lay the charge, can bring the evidence to court, and not just refer the charge, meaning that the people who are entrusted with an investigation are the people who can affect the change. We also have to know what that looks like to women. What is justice for women? End quote. So, Madam Chair, my feeling at this point is that we really need to get on and start with that vitally important military justice study so that we can really get the kind of information and testimony and recommendations that we need to move forward. I would also note, Madam Chair, that we have now heard in this study from all of the relevant players. We have now heard from the clerk of the Privy Council who said that PCO took carriage of this matter and that everybody acted in good faith. We have heard from Janine Sherman, the Secretary to the Cabinet, who said that she tried very hard to get the kind of evidence so that she could continue and continue an investigation, but that evidence wasn't there. And I think what we need to do is, throughout all of this process, we now know pretty much what has happened here. In 2018, there was an email, and we know this now through the media and through other sources. But we know that there was an email in 2018. That email had a sexually suggestive comment. And it was couched as a joke. But I think our committee and the members of our committee and those who are here present today understand very well that a sexually suggestive comment that is couched as some kind of a joke is not funny. It is not something that you can just brush off. It is intended to cause harm. It is intended to diminish. It is intended to demean. And when it's done in front of others, it is extremely harmful because it is about power and it is not funny. And I do believe, Madam Chair, that the members who are present in the committee today understand this very, very well. So I am not saying, I'm not diminishing the seriousness of that kind of allegation. However, what we know is that the woman who received that email did not want to pursue an investigation. And there are members of this committee who have accused me of victim blaming just because I stood up for the right of the survivor and the person coming forward who's impacted to have the right to give their consent. And that is not victim blaming, Madam Chair. That is respect for consent. And this particular person did not give permission to the ombudsperson to give that email to the appropriate authorities who wanted to investigate, and that is in the Privy Council office. The highest public servant in the land was given carriage of this. And that concluded that there was not a threshold of evidence. And again, Madam Chair, I would like to quote some testimony that was heard in the Status of Women Committee from Brigadier General Simon Trudeau, who is the Provost Marshal of the Canadian Armed Forces. And he said, when a complaint is referred then to the CFNIS, first they have to determine whether it meets the threshold to trigger a police investigation. There has to be a threshold, Madam Chair. Everybody knows that you can want to investigate and you can want to hold people to account. But if there is no threshold, and let's look at what all of our testimony has showed here, is that PCO, who are the authority, it should never be a political office. And what we've seen throughout is that all of the political staff and the political elected people have all throughout this made sure that it was not a political office that actually investigated this. And that is vitally important because politicians can make mistakes. We are not investigators. One mistake I would point to is that I saw that here, just one of the opposition members who said in question period that we should have, that somehow they should have gone to General Vance and asked him about this confidential complaint. The last thing you do when you have a victim that wants to remain confidential is go and tip off the person that they're complaining about, because that person could probably fairly easily figure out who it is. And that opens up the vulnerability for that person who wanted to remain confidential. The last thing you do, and that's why politicians should not be the ones that conduct these investigations, because we might be well-intentioned, but we are not trained and we are not the appropriate place. So it went to the Privy Council office. And at that point, there was not a name of a person. The person received the email. We didn't have the name. They did not have the nature of it. They did not have any evidence. So at that point, in the words of Mr. Wernick, there was an impasse. That's what we know. We know exactly what happened. And Mr. Wernick said, and I believe this, Madam Chair, that everybody acted in good faith. What the key issue here is why the person, the woman in this case, didn't feel safe to come forward. That has been the focus. That has been what I have been working on, what the minister has been working on, what the government has been working on, what this committee and other committees have been working on, is how do we get to a point where we can create an environment where women and men and transgender and non-binary serving members and members of the civilian staff of D&D feel that they can safely come forward, and when they come forward, that they will get a just outcome, that they will actually not face the kind of impunity that we have seen, or that there has been some semblance that many people have said that they have experienced. So, Madam Chair, I think our committee right now is at a crossroad. We have some very important work we could do. We could, and by the way, Mr. Garrison's comment that he made about we could start comparing comparative failures, we could do that, Madam Chair, we could. We know that even though in 2018 there was a confidential complaint of which we didn't know exactly what it was, but we do know that in 2015, before when the previous Conservative government was in power, before General Vance was sworn in, as was the change of command ceremony happened for him to become the Chief of Defence Staff, while he was being vetted, we know that there was knowledge of different complaints, and complaints that have to do with Gagetown and with a relationship with a subordinate. We know that there were rumors at that time, and we know that the current leader of the opposition, Mr. O'Toole, knew of those rumors, and his chief of staff knew of those rumors. We know this from Mr. Novak's testimony, and that they brought that to PCO. So they're doing very similar to the process that we followed in 2018. And then at that point in the testimony that we heard from Mr. Novak, he said that there was an investigation, and that if that investigation were to have shown that there was any wrongdoing, that they were prepared to cancel the appointment of General Vance to Chief of Defence Staff. Madam Chair, we just found out this week, and I find this very disturbing because, remember, this is before he was even appointed. We just found out that he was, and I'm just going to look here from the news article, that just days after the Conservatives appointed General Vance, the investigation was suddenly dropped. There was an access to information request that came out this week that said that the commanding officer, the military police, felt they were under pressure. And we don't know under pressure from whom, but what we do know is that suddenly on the day that General Vance, the change of command ceremony happened, suddenly there was, and he was under active investigation. I think this is a CFNIS investigation, the military police investigation. And that day, after the change of command ceremony, it took another 4 days before that investigation was suddenly ended. And I may be incorrect, but I do believe that to end a military police investigation, to end a CFNIS study investigation, I do believe that is the Chief of Defence Staff that has to sign off on that. I may be incorrect on that, but he was then, at that point, the Chief of Defence Staff. So I think we could, if we wanted to, bring Mr. Novak back and say, well, he said that it was investigated before he was appointed, and that they wouldn't have appointed him if they had any kind of bad outcome of that investigation. But we know now that it was ongoing at the time that he was appointed. And one of the things that I find really difficult about this is because I've been talking to survivors. And last weekend on Saturday, I had a conversation with a survivor, and had a lot of conversations. We've had a lot of roundtables. I've heard from many during the course of this. But this particular conversation has stuck with me. It has shaken me. The person knows who they are if they're listening to this testimony. And I think that one of the worst parts of what this individual told me is that when the rapist, the alleged rapist in this case, was under investigation, this person's attacker, in order to get them out, was promoted while the investigation was open. And one of the first things that this individual said to me was, there needs to be a blanket policy that if somebody is under current investigation, they can't be promoted. Madam Chair, we now see in the media, and I mean, we could spend a lot of time in this committee trying to get to the bottom of this, but we now see in the media that that is exactly what happened with the Harper government when Jonathan Vance was promoted while an open investigation was ongoing. And Madam Chair, the people who experience this kind of misconduct deserve a lot better than that. But Madam Chair, I'm hearing what survivors have said, and I'm hearing what Mr. Garrison has said as well, about the fact that we all failed. All governments for many, many, many years, we have all failed the women and men and transgender and non-binary and racialized and LGBTQ2 members of our Canadian Armed Forces. We have failed them. And the last thing I want to do is have this committee descending into finger pointing, into politics. I do believe, Madam Chair, that we have important recommendations to get out. We have two important reports. Mental health is very intricately related to this. And I do think we need to get that mental health report out. I also think that we need to get on to the study on military justice so that we can participate in the other studies that are ongoing. Justice Fish is working right now on a review of the military justice system. And we have a number of others, including the announcement that we made yesterday about Madame Arbour. Some of her terms of reference include looking at the military justice system. And may I add, Madam Chair, that Madame Arbour is a personal hero of mine. I was working 20 years ago, over 20 years ago now, in the former Yugoslavia. I worked in Bosnia for 6 months. I worked in Kosovo for a year. I did a lot of work back and forth, traveling back and forth to the region. And I met a lot of the survivors there. And it is because of Madame Arbour's work. We all know her as a former Supreme Court Justice in Canada. But in fact, her work at The Hague in the criminal tribunal on the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, it was the seminal turning point that allowed rape to be defined under international law as a war crime. She is the person who made sure that for the atrocities that occurred in those regions of the world, that there was no impunity, that the perpetrators were held to account. And now she is the one that we have entrusted to define how we are going to move ahead and get this right. And Madam Chair, I know there's been a lot of criticism saying, well, it's just another review. And I know that Madame Deschamps' report was 6 years ago. And I know that we didn't do enough and not fast enough to implement that. We have done many, many things. We put legislation, Bill C-77, which also in yesterday's announcement, we are going to be now moving ahead on making sure we have anonymous, a possibility for people to provide their input anonymously on how we get those regulations right on the Declaration of Victims' Rights, which we passed in the previous Parliament, Bill C-77. We have also established a whole new institution, the SMRCs, the Sexual Misconduct Response Centers. And we put that under the Department of Defense. It's not in the chain of command, it's under the department. And yes, there were probably well-intentioned individuals in the department and in the ministry who thought that that was enough. And we know now it wasn't. We know now that we've heard from all the testimony, it has to be outside the chain of command. And yesterday, we have assigned, it's the external comprehensive review with Madame Arbour, who's going to be looking into an independent external reporting system outside of the chain of command. She's going to review policies, procedures, programs, practices, and culture. She's going to review systemic issues and culture change, the military justice system, the system of rewards and promotions. And again, this is something that is very important because we saw when Mr. O'Toole was aware of some rumors on this, that when that went to the NIS, he was promoted while that investigation was still open. So this is one of the things we need to look at is how do we promote and reward? and making sure that people who display these behaviors and who do this kind of thing do not get rewarded and promoted. And I would just also like to note that Madame Deschamps herself yesterday made a statement, and I'd like to read the statement that she made about the appointment of Madame Arbour. She said, "I welcome the appointment of Madame Arbour. From what I read, her mandate appears to be broader than the one that I was given. This would not be a mere repetition of what I did." So this is from Madame Deschamps herself. And yes, we know that all governments, all of us, for 40 years, I had somebody phone me and told me about something that had happened to her 40 years ago in the military. This has been decades long. And Madam Chair, I think we need to move on to our study on military justice. I think we need to focus on the mental health study that is already drafted, that we just need to come to a consensus and table in the House. I think we need to focus on the survivors. And I think that after 3 months, after all of the testimony that we've heard, we could continue down this road, and we could call witness after witness, and we've got a list. Of course we could call the person who said in 2015 that he felt he was under pressure. We could call all of these people, but you know what, Madam Chair, we're rising above it, because it is time that we focus on the survivors. It is time that we move ahead with the good work of this committee, and I believe that that is exactly what we need to do. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you very much, Madame Van der Belde. Mr. Spengeman, please.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. With your indulgence and the committee's indulgence, I'd like to make a brief intervention on the question of trust, and going back to what Mr. Garrison said a number of interventions ago. I think trust is front and center in so many ways. Trust is what drives the effectiveness, the health, the reputation of any organization. Trust takes a long time to build, and it takes a very, very short time to destroy or to threaten to erode. And that's what we're facing in the Canadian Forces. That's, as I've alluded to, what a number of other jurisdictions are facing. And I want to point out to the committee that trust takes a number of different forms. It's trust among serving members, it's trust across ranks, it's trust across genders, it's trust across the entire spectrum of equity, diversity, and inclusion within the Canadian Forces. It's also trust vis-a-vis civilian employees, trust that recruits have by exploring whether or not they would want to join the Canadian Forces. It's trust between militaries, and equally importantly, it's trust as we talk as members of this committee among ourselves. I think in that respect, it is important that we overcome partisanship to the greatest possible extent and start to get to the same side of the table and tackle the problem together. And I think the conversation this afternoon is taking us in that direction. So I'm encouraged and optimistic by what I've heard so far, Madam Chair. Let me start this brief intervention with a quote. I'm going to quote a tweet from Minister Sajjan that was sent literally 24 hours ago, yesterday afternoon. He writes on Twitter, "Every day our Canadian Forces members risk their lives to support our allies, partners, and friends, but it is clear that we have not lived up to our responsibility to protect members from sexual misconduct." That is our Minister of National Defense, Harjit Sajjan, who's testified to this committee for a 6-hour period. Prime Minister Trudeau has taken questions on this issue in the House, and it is clear that with respect to the allegations involving the former Chief of Defence Staff under the tenure of our government, as colleagues have pointed out in previous interventions, I won't repeat all the details, but that the evidentiary threshold that's required has not been reached, and it has not been reached because the strong preference of the complainant was that she did not trust the system to the extent that she would want to come forward. And Madam Chair, even if it had been reached, we have received strong evidence across witnesses submitted by all members, by all parties on this committee, that it is not appropriate for a minister, for a prime minister, to then take action to launch an investigation to influence an investigative process, but that the right process is to bring this to the attention of the proper regulatory and investigative authorities. That's the state of evidence as it is before the committee. My colleague, Ms. Van der Belde, a minute ago mentioned some new information that came to the committee's attention with respect to the former Chief of Defence Staff. In an article about a week ago, he claims, or he's reported to have claimed, that he is untouchable, that he owns the the Canadian Forces National Investigative Service. We then found out that there was an investigation which, subsequent to his appointment, was stopped some 4 days afterwards. The appointment of the former Chief of Defence Staff took place under the Stephen Harper government and members of his cabinet, including Aaron O'Toole, who was then Minister of Veterans Affairs. I say this not because it is a partisan conclusion. It's not. It's no more partisan. It is nonpartisan in the same sense that the discussion with respect to the former Chief of Defence Staff and allegations of misconduct 2018 forward are not partisan. They occurred under the Trudeau government, but we heard very emphatically that elected officials do not have a role in the investigative process to the same effect that would hold true of Prime Minister Harper and Aaron O'Toole in his then capacity. But the transpartisan interest on the part of every official and every member of this committee should be to find out how and why a Chief of Defence Staff who claims to own the Canadian Forces National Investigative Service is then somehow all of a sudden let off the hook 4 days later because subsequent to his appointment, an investigation is dropped. That is a question that is nonpartisan. That is a structural question with respect to the power structures in the Canadian Forces. That is a question that needs to be answered, and recommendations need to be put forward, as my colleague in her previous intervention pointed out, to the effect that a serving member of the Canadian Forces who is under investigation may not or should not be promoted during that investigation. That is one clear recommendation that colleagues could react to, that we could put forward. That's the kind of track that we should move forward on as members of this committee, united in our quest to restore trust in the Canadian Armed Forces. And Madam Chair, if you permit me, just a brief closing word on the question of trust. Trust also extends, as was pointed out in previous testimony, to the leadership role that the Canadian Forces play in so many parts of the world, and the potential for the Canadian Forces to continue to lead on questions of gender equality, of diversity and inclusion. We're out front on the ELSI initiative, on the initiatives around women and peace and security, because we have recognized that when we empower women in the Canadian Forces, in peacekeeping operations and NATO operations, we do the right thing morally, because women have a right to serve as much as every other gender, but we also achieve much better peacekeeping and operational outcomes. And it is that trust also that we should focus on. It isn't only limited to what the Canadian Forces do within our borders. It is the leadership role that they can and should project around the world. And that is really where the committee should and could direct its attention. I encourage all of us, I think, as we have moved towards in conversation this afternoon, to come to the same side of the table on this problem. It cuts across two governments. It isn't solved yet. We have a very authoritative, leading, eminent thinker who has been empowered to write a report and to give us her recommendation. In parallel with that, we can keep pace. We can potentially even move some recommendations out front and achieve some changes out front as she does her work. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll turn it back to you, and thank you for the time.
All right, on to Mr. Garrison, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I understand that we're coming to the end of our normal scheduled time for this committee, and that the House of Commons, as usual, especially on a Friday, will have trouble maintaining resources for interpretation and other necessary services. So I'm hoping, Madam Chair, that you could take note of the speakers list that exists now, and I would hope to be able to speak when we resume on this topic. But at this point, I will move to suspend the committee to its normal meeting time Monday morning when we return to this motion.
So are you making a motion to adjourn, Mr. Garrison?
No, I am not. I am making a motion to suspend to Monday morning at our normal time.
I'm not. Let me look into that.
Madam Chair, could you suspend for just 2 minutes just to figure out? That would be helpful.
A motion on a motion.
Oh, no, it's not.
Point of
I'm
order.
just asking the chair
we're
while
trying
we're
to decide
discussing
whether
motion to just
the
suspend for a
motion
couple
is in
minutes.
order. So in the meantime, I can suspend for 2 minutes. There's no trouble doing that. So go ahead, suspend for 2 minutes. Okay. So what we've been able to determine that a motion from the floor for suspension is not a normal proceeding. So a motion to adjourn from the floor is a normal proceeding and therefore an order to, but a motion to suspend is not. I'm sorry, Mr. Garrison.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Then I appreciate your advice, and I move that we continue discussion on the motion on the floor at our next scheduled meeting on Monday, and that we do now adjourn.
Okay, I think we'd have to give people time to consider that as well. Monday, what do we have on Monday?
Madam Chair, is that admissible to?
As a point where I would call that a substantive motion, and so it'd be debatable, but it's providing direction to the committee to continue this meeting on Monday and let the meeting adjourn. So I'd say that it is admissible.
Mr. Bazan.
You can make
I'm going to
there,
suspend again. Thank you. Okay, would you like to speak to this, Mr. Garrison, and explain what you're asking so we perfectly understand what's before us now?
Well, I'm attempting to accomplish the same thing as in my first motion. We have exhausted our normally scheduled time. The House of Commons has limited resources. We strain all the staff during COVID all of the time. And so my suggestion is that we have not dealt with this matter, and I won't go into reasons why we have not. And so my motion is that we return to this matter on Monday morning during our regularly scheduled time and that we do now adjourn. It's fairly simple and fairly straightforward.
All right, does anybody else want to weigh in on this? Okay, go ahead. Mr. let's see, Mr.
Are we done being suspended now? And then we're now back in public? Thank you.
Yes. All right, let me check this. So it was Mr. Bagnall, did you want to speak to this particular issue? Or is that left over? Okay, go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just want for clarification, but for clarity for committee that if I understand the intent of Mr. Garrison's motion, that we continue on with the debate of this motion on Monday morning. I just want to make sure that the conditions surrounding this meeting are the conditions that we use in the meeting on Monday, which is that it's in public, that it's televised, and that we start off with the motion. If I have to retable that motion on Monday morning, I'm more than happy to do it. But I want to make sure that's the conditions of bringing on the motion. I appreciate why Mr. Garrison wants to adjourn in the interest of our support staff and the interpreters in particularly, and how strenuous this job can be, and interpreting members for extended periods of time. So we'll support that as long as we're under the understanding that this continues on, because we do need to get to a resolution on having Katie Telford appear before this committee.
Okay, Monsieur Barcelou-Duval.
Mr. Barcelou-Duval, please. Thank you, Madam Chair. Perhaps there's something I don't understand at the technical level, but I would like to know. I thought I had understood that the continuation of the debate after a certain time, we can no longer ask to suspend. Can you explain technically why we cannot ask for suspension at 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. and why we have to ask for it now if we want to ask for it? Because I agree with the position raised that we ought to be able to wind up and exhaust the subject before we complete the debate on it, whether it's today or some other day in the committee's deliberations. But I'm trying to understand why, if it stretches on, why we cannot suspend later. That's what I would like to get a clarification on.
Madam Chair, I just say on Monsieur Barcelou-Duval's comment that in the past you have suspended meetings for days on end till we resumed at our regular time. So I think that's the point that he was asking. If we continue on in the debate and then you just suspend when you've determined it's enough, then we'll continue on Monday.
Mr. Bazan, I don't remember you being given the floor.
Well, as vice chair, I can step in.
All right. Come on now. No, it's not a normal procedure. It's not a normal motion for a suspension to come from the floor, right? So it's just, look, we're giving them a headache, all right? So listen, I think this is something that people will want to understand clearly before we go down this road, myself included. So, and we all know what Monday was scheduled to be. Monday was scheduled to be draft reports, mental health and CAF and COVID. So that's what this decision will mean, that we will not be doing those reports. And we would, is what I'm understanding, and this is what I want to make sure everyone's clear. It means that we will not be doing those draft reports on Monday, and instead we will be doing this particular motion. Now, this could impact over the long term, and I think that those reports are very important to get out. And if we're going to make that decision, then everybody should understand completely what the decision is, and that's why I'm trying to get some kind of clarity here. Okay.
Pardon me, Madam Chair, if I may speak. Yeah, okay, so. We spent pretty well almost the 2 hours of this meeting discussing the recommendations for the report that's going to be generated from the study we're talking about today. So perhaps we can reallocate that time that we already spent today so that we will stay on our eventual timeline.
You know, Madame Gallant, everyone has the right to participate in the debate. Everybody does. You might not like what they have to say, but debate is about people putting opposite points of view on the table. And that's, I think, where we are now. There are different points of view. So sometimes I think debate is really critical and it's important. But if we're going to have an impact on our ability to actually produce reports, then I think people, when they're making decisions and we're going to do a vote, we need to understand completely what we are voting for or against. Okay, and that's what I'm trying to get, that level of clarity. Thank you. All right, so the clerk just told me that it won't be considered a substantive motion because there's already a motion on the floor. So our choices are to carry on the debate or to adjourn. So unfortunately, that motion is not in order because there's already another motion on the floor. And that was the kind of detail we were trying to get to make sure that we understood this. All right? I'm sorry, Mr. Garrison.
Okay, Madam Chair. Then I think I need to go back and challenge your decision that we cannot suspend.
Madam Chair,
so I challenge the chair's decision.
Madam Chair, could we hear from the clerk? Because I heard what the clerk said to you, but I don't think the other members did. And I think we might want to hear what the clerk said that I heard. Are we still, Madam Chair, are we suspended or are we still in? Okay, because my understanding is that there's only 3 dilatory motions: a motion to adjourn the meeting, a motion to adjourn the debate, and a motion to change the order of business. So that would mean that if it's not a dilatory motion, then it can't be debated if it's substantive at the same time as a substantive motion, which I believe was your ruling. But I heard the clerk say that to you, and I'm just wondering if the members could hear that what I overheard. My apologies, I'm in the room and they're not, and I don't think it's fair that I heard what the clerk said and they didn't, but essentially it can't be a debatable motion when you have a debatable motion on the floor. And there's only 3 dilatory motions, and that's to adjourn.
To address the issue, allow me to say the following. The motion that the sitting be suspended can be moved. It can be treated the same way as a motion to adjourn. Then the chair uses their discretion as to when to resume.
It's not in the books. So it's not a dilatory motion as outlined in the books. So we just have to make sure that whatever we're doing, we at least try and, follow at least the intent of things. And I get that. So I want to make sure that people understand what the decision is they are actually making clearly. So,
Madam Chair, I believe I still have the floor. And having heard now from the clerk that a motion to suspend is in order, I would like to return to that motion. That is what I've intended this whole time. So I do move the committee.
There's another motion on the floor, Mr. Garrison. There's another active motion on the floor.
This is not a substantive motion. It is not a substantive motion. We're receiving advice from our parliamentary experts that it is completely in order, that it is not a substantive motion, and therefore I'm challenging your decision if you're saying it's out of order.
Just point of order, Madam Chair. Just want to make sure we know which motion that we're dealing with at this point in time. I know that there's a challenge to the chair, and I agree with that, but I just want to make sure we're on the same page on the same motion.
You and me both, Mr. Bazan. To suspend for 5 minutes. Let everybody have a look, get your advice, read the book, and we'll come back in 5 minutes, okay? Suspended. they're still talking about it. It's going further, whether how much in order this is or not. Okay, but I am getting the impression that it's the will of the committee to suspend. Did you want to speak, Mr. Bazan or Mr. Barcelou Duval, either one of you? Or Mr. Garrison, are you good? Okay.
I would just, again, for clarity, if you're suspending them Monday morning, we start off with this debate.
That's the thing, Mr. Bazan. It cannot have conditions attached.
I know, but if you're suspending, the meeting continues on Monday. Is that clear?
It cannot have conditions attached, Mr. Bazan. So it cannot have conditions attached. So, okay.
But so I'm just asking for clarity, Madam Chair. I'm not putting conditions. I'm just asking for clarity, since you're suggesting you'll suspend the meeting, which I'm okay with. But for clarity purposes, I just want to make sure that if you are suspending, then this meeting continues on Monday morning.
What it does do, Mr. Bazan, is it makes it clear that the will of the committee is to supersede the work of reviewing those draft reports. Now, that's what you need to understand. It will supersede our work plan, and it means that those draft reports might not get done. So that's what it means. And so I want it to be perfectly clear if you give me the direction to suspend, I will do so. But that's what it means. It puts those draft reports, it supersedes all the work we need to do to get those draft reports published, okay? So, is it the will of the committee to suspend? Yes? Suspend.